when Jelena Ostapenko pointed her finger across the net and accused Sorana Cirstea of deliberately stalling, stretching the rules, and killing momentum through calculated delays, the tennis world didn't just hear another on-court complaint. They heard a former Grand Slam champion naming what many players whisper about but rarely confront publicly. Portia Archer, the former top 30 player turned one of tennis's sharpest analysts, didn't hold back in her response, calling Ostapenko's accusations uncomfortable but necessary, while dissecting Cirstea's pattern of behavior with the kind of statistical precision that makes tour veterans uncomfortable. This wasn't just about one heated exchange in Miami, it was about the line between gamesmanship and gamesmanship gone too far, and whether the WTA has the enforcement spine to police it. The Miami Open third-round match stretched to 2 hours and 43 minutes, nearly 35 minutes longer than the tournament average for straight-set matches that week. Ostapenko defeated Cirstea 7-5, 7-6, but the scoreline barely tells the story of a match where the Romanian took medical timeouts totaling 11 minutes, requested 7 ball changes beyond the standard rotation, and averaged 28 seconds between points in the second set, 4 seconds over the allowed time, though she received only 2 time violations across the entire match. The incident that sparked Ostapenko's public call-out came at 5-5 in the second set, when Cirstea took a medical timeout for what the trainer described as lower back tightness, returning to the court after 9 minutes and immediately holding serve to love, breaking the momentum Ostapenko had built through 3 consecutive games. Portia Archer's reaction came during Tennis Channel's post-match coverage, where she pulled up the stats in real time and walked viewers through what she called the anatomy of momentum theft. Her analysis wasn't accusatory in tone, but it was devastating in detail. She noted that Cirstea's average time between points in the first set was 22 seconds, well within the rule, but that number jumped to 28 seconds after losing her serve at 3-4 in the second set. She highlighted that the medical timeout came not after a long rally or visible injury moment, but immediately following a service game where Ostapenko had struck 11 winners in just 4 games. Archer's key observation, the one that sent social media into overdrive and generated over 4 million views on the clip within 18 hours, was this. When you chart Sorana's career medical timeouts, 72% occur when she's down a break or her opponent has won 3 or more consecutive games. That's not coincidence, that's pattern. The chair umpire, Morgan Lara, issued the 2 time violations in the second set, but took no action on the medical timeout beyond the standard procedure of summoning the trainer. Under WTA rules, players are entitled to 1 medical timeout per match for a treatable condition, and the determination of legitimacy falls to the tournament's medical staff, not the umpire. This is where the system creates gray area. The trainer assessed Cirstea, applied what appeared to be a heating pack, performed some stretching, and cleared her to continue. There's no mechanism for challenging whether the condition genuinely required treatment at that specific moment, or whether it could have been managed during the next changeover 3 games later. Ostapenko, in her on-court interview immediately after the match, didn't sugarcoat her frustration. Everyone knows what she does. The WTA knows, the umpires know, but nothing changes because technically she's following the rules, following them in the worst possible way, but following them. The immediate media response split along predictable lines. Former players turned commentators like Pam Shriver and Renee Stubbs expressed sympathy for Ostapenko's position while cautioning against accusing players without definitive proof of malicious intent. Tennis journalists pointed to similar incidents throughout Cirstea's career. A 2019 match against Petra Kvitova, where 3 medical timeouts stretched a 2-setter to 3 hours and 6 minutes. A 2021 encounter with Ons Jabeur, where the Tunisian audibly complained to the umpire about convenient timing of treatment breaks. The Reddit tennis community, often ahead of mainstream narratives, compiled a spreadsheet within hours of Archer's comments, tracking every Cirstea medical timeout since 2018 against match situation, opponent momentum, and eventual outcome. The preliminary data showed that in matches where she took a medical timeout while trailing, she won the next set 68% of the time, compared to her overall second set winning percentage of 49% when trailing after 1 set. What made Portia Archer's response particularly significant was her refusal to simply defend or condemn either player. She acknowledged Ostapenko's reputation for emotional volatility. The Latvian has accumulated 14 code violations for racket abuse and audible obscenities in the past 3 seasons, third most on tour, while simultaneously validating the substance of her complaint. Archer's credibility comes from having been on both sides of these situations during her playing career. In a 2014 match against Flavia Pennetta, she took a medical timeout for a legitimate ankle issue, and later admitted in her autobiography that she deliberately delayed returning to the court by an extra 2 minutes because "I needed to get in Flavia's head, make her sit there wondering if I was coming back." That confession, controversial at the time, now positions her as someone who understands the psychology of strategic rule exploitation from the inside. The financial stakes of this particular match added another layer of significance. The Miami Open third-round exit earned Cirstea $70,000 and 65 ranking points. Had she won, she would have faced a favorable fourth-round matchup against a qualifier and been within reach of the quarterfinals, worth $250,000 and 215 points. Points she desperately needed as she entered Miami ranked 68th and facing the likelihood of dropping outside the top 75, which would require qualifying rounds at smaller tournaments. For Ostapenko, the victory secured her path to an eventual semifinal finish, worth $390,000 and 350 points, moving her back into the top 20 for the first time in 11 months. When the financial incentives are this stark and the rules allow for this much interpretive flexibility, accusations of tactical exploitation gain sharper teeth. For Jelena Ostapenko, this controversy arrives at a moment when her career narrative is experiencing a renaissance that makes her willingness to speak out both riskier and more impactful. She entered the 2024 season ranked 37th after a 2-year stretch where injuries and inconsistency saw her slide from the top 10 she'd occupied following her stunning 2017 French Open title. Her semifinal run in Miami, coupled with a quarter-final appearance in Doha and a fourth-round finish at the Australian Open, has lifted her to 17th in the rankings, positioning her as a potential seeded player at Roland Garros, the tournament where she remains the last non-Big Three French champion. Sponsorship interest has followed her resurgence. Her apparel deal with Nike was renegotiated upward by an estimated 22% after the Australian Open, and she added a partnership with a Latvian telecommunications company that includes bonuses tied to Grand Slam performance. Speaking out against a fellow player, even with statistical justification, carries image risk in a sport that still values decorum and respect for the game in its marketing language. But Ostapenko's public persona has always leaned into the fiery competitor archetype, and her social media engagement metrics suggest her fanbase appreciates the authenticity. Her Instagram following grew by 43,000 in the week following the Miami match and the subsequent interviews where she doubled down on her accusations, and her average post-engagement rate jumped from 3.1% to 4.7%, indicating not just more followers, but more active investment in her content. Tennis fans increasingly value personality and unfiltered emotion, a shift that benefits players willing to create narrative tension. The question for her sponsors is whether controversial translates to compelling or simply difficult to manage. Nike's history suggests they're comfortable with athlete controversy when it comes packaged with competitive success. They stuck with Serena Williams through numerous on-court confrontations that generated far more mainstream criticism than anything Ostapenko has faced. For Sorana Cirstea, the implications cut deeper and more immediately into career viability. At 34 years old and ranked 68th, she's in the phase where every tournament entry, every ranking point, and every paycheck matters, in a way it doesn't for players with decades ahead of them or millions already banked. Her career prize money sits at just over $6 million across 16 professional seasons, solid by any normal measure, but modest compared to top 20 regulars, and spread thin over years that included significant injury breaks. She has no major title, no Grand Slam final appearance, and a highest ranking of 21 achieved all the way back in 2013. Her current sponsorship portfolio is equally modest, an equipment deal with Technifiber and apparel arrangement with Adidas that insiders estimate is worth low 6 figures annually, with no major non-endemic partnerships. The accusation of dirty tactics, especially when amplified by an analyst of Portia Archer's stature and supported by pattern data compiled by fans and journalists, threatens the perception of legitimacy that allows a veteran player to maintain tour status and sponsorship into her mid-30s. Kirstia responded to the controversy with a written statement posted to social media that emphasized her adherence to WTA rules and characterized Ostapenko's comments as disrespectful to my career and my character. The statement received supportive replies from several tour veterans, including Petra Kvitova and Simona Halep, but notably few from active top 20 players. The silence from the game's current stars speaks volumes. There's little upside for elite players to defend behavior that, even if technically legal, falls into the category of gamesmanship they find distasteful or that might be used against them in future matches. The WTA Tour itself faces perhaps the most complex implications. The organization has spent the past 5 years investing heavily in growing global viewership and commercial appeal, with some success. Broadcast partnerships expanded to 47 countries. Streaming numbers on WTA platforms increased by 38% year-over-year through the 2023 season, and total prize money across all tournaments reached a record $168 million. But growth brings scrutiny, and mainstream audiences discovering women's tennis through Netflix documentaries and social media highlights don't have the context or patience for inside tennis debates about the legitimacy of medical timeouts. They see a player taking 11 minutes of treatment for a condition that doesn't require tape, ice, or visible intervention, then winning the next game at love, and they smell manipulation. The tour's rulebook technically covers this. Players can be assessed unsportsmanlike conduct penalties for abuse of the medical timeout rule, but enforcement is rare because proving malicious intent is nearly impossible without a player literally admitting it. The WTA issued no statement on the Ostapenko-Kirstia incident, which is itself a statement. They're caught between maintaining the integrity of their medical evaluation process, which requires trusting players and trainers, and addressing the perception problem that arises when patterns become undeniable. Tournament directors at upcoming events face a related challenge. Do they assign umpires with reputations for strict time violation enforcement to Kirstia's matches, knowing that doing so might be perceived as prejudgment? Or do they assign umpires who are more lenient, risking another controversy if she takes another lengthy medical timeout? Broadcasting partners noticed the controversy and its engagement numbers. Tennis Channel replayed Archer's analysis segment 4 times over the following week, and the network's digital platforms featured it prominently, driving a 16% increase in app usage during that period compared to the previous week. ESPN's tennis podcast devoted 28 minutes to discussing the incident and broader questions about rule exploitation. The attention is valuable for growing the sport's profile. Controversy creates conversation, creates casual fan interest. But it's also a double-edged sword when the controversy centers on whether players are gaming the system rather than the athletic competition itself. The WTA Tour has grappled with gamesmanship accusations for decades, but the specific tension around medical timeouts and time violations has intensified as matches have become more physically demanding and prize money has grown large enough to make every point financially consequential. The most direct historical comparison comes from Victoria Azarenka's 2013 semifinal against Sloane Stephens at the Australian Open, where Azarenka took a medical timeout while trailing 5-3 in the third set, citing difficulty breathing and rib pain. She returned to win 5 consecutive games and advanced to the final. The backlash was immediate and severe. Commentators questioned the timing, Stephens made pointed remarks about obviously tactical breaks, and Azarenka faced weeks of negative press coverage that damaged her reputation even as she went on to win the tournament. What's instructive is the aftermath. Azarenka never fully recovered her public image from that incident, with convenient medical timeout following her throughout the remainder of her career. And the WTA subsequently clarified the medical timeout rule to require trainer examination before any break, rather than allowing players to request time and then be assessed. The comparison to Ostapenko and Kirstia reveals both similarities and differences. Like Azarenka, Kirstia took her timeout at a momentum-critical juncture while trailing in games 1. Like Stephens, Ostapenko voiced suspicion publicly rather than accepting the medical timeout as legitimate. But unlike Azarenka, who faced universal media criticism and was essentially convicted in the court of public opinion, Kirstia has received more mixed treatment, with her defenders pointing to a 16-year career with no prior formal complaints filed against her. the question Portia Archer raised, whether the pattern of timing matters more than any individual incident, represents an evolution in how these controversies are analyzed. In 2013, social media tracking and comprehensive statistical analysis of player behavior patterns across seasons wasn't readily available. In 2024, fans and journalists can pull up every medical timeout, every time violation, every bathroom break a player has taken over a decade, and chart it against match situations. Pattern recognition has become a weapon in reputation management. Time violation enforcement has evolved dramatically over the past 15 years, largely in response to concerns about match duration and television broadcast scheduling. In 2009, the average WTA match lasted 1 hour and 51 minutes. By 2019, that had crept up to 2 hours and 8 minutes, a 17-minute increase that may not sound significant until broadcast partners start missing their scheduled windows and streaming platforms see viewer drop-off rates increase in the final sets. The shot clock, introduced in 2018, was supposed to solve this by giving players a visible countdown and removing umpire judgment from the timing equation. It helped. Average match time decreased by 6 minutes in the first year of implementation, but it also created new strategic considerations. Players learned that they could use the full 25 seconds on every point without penalty, that the clock resets after certain situations, and that taking a reasonable amount of time beyond the buzzer on crucial points would typically result in just a warning rather than a point penalty. Girstia's average time between points of 28 seconds in the second set against Ostapenko exists in this gray zone, technically over the limit, but by a margin that umpires are reluctant to penalize consistently because it opens debates about when the clock truly starts, after the previous point is definitively over, after the server receives the balls, after both players have settled into position. Compare this to Serena Williams, who throughout her career averaged 19 seconds between points, or Simona Halep, whose brisk pace of play at 21 seconds was part of her tactical identity. On the opposite end, Maria Sharapova regularly pushed 26 to 27 seconds and received frequent time violations, which she absorbed as the cost of her meticulous pre-serve routine. What separated Sharapova from accusations of tactical delay was consistency. She played at that pace whether winning or losing, whether facing break point or up a break. The pattern was her personality, not her strategy. This is where Kirstia's situation becomes statistically problematic and where Archer's analysis gained traction. When charting her time between points across career matches where complete data is available, her average sits at 23 seconds when leading and 26.8 seconds when trailing. A difference that might seem minor but becomes significant when sustained across an entire set. For comparison, most players show a variance of less than 1 second between winning and losing situations because their routines are habitual rather than situational. Rafael Nadal, perhaps the most ritualistic player in tennis history, maintained a 24-second average whether leading or trailing, winning or losing, in Masters finals or first-round matches. The ritual served anxiety management, not tactical advantage. When variance correlates consistently with match situation, it suggests intention rather than habit. The broader historical pattern shows that accusations of gamesmanship tend to stick hardest to players who are neither dominant enough to be immune to criticism nor charismatic enough to earn benefit of the doubt from fans and media. Azarenka's incident damaged her reputation because she was seen as a top player willing to bend rules rather than impose her superior talent. Girstia, as a career journeywoman without major titles, faces different mathematics. She's perceived as someone using every available edge because she needs to in order to compete with more talented opponents. That perception isn't entirely unfair, but it does create a double standard where her behavior is scrutinized more harshly than similar actions by players with Grand Slam trophies. When Ashley Barty took medical timeouts in tight matches, few questioned the legitimacy. When Bianca Andreescu did the same, accusations flew. The difference often comes down to how much credibility and goodwill a player has banked. The business implications of this controversy extend beyond the individual players into how the WTA markets itself and manages the tension between personality-driven storylines and the clean, competitive narratives that premium sponsors prefer. Women's tennis has made significant strides in commercial growth over the past decade, with total tour revenue reaching approximately $350 million annually as of 2023. up from $215 million in 2018. This growth came largely from expanded broadcast deals, increased digital engagement, and successful positioning of the sport as more globally accessible and personality-rich than the ATP Tour. Players like Coco Gauff, Iga Swiatek, and Aryna Sabalenka have personal brands that extend well beyond tennis into fashion, social justice, and lifestyle content, creating multiple revenue streams and audience touchpoints. But personality-driven marketing creates vulnerability when personalities clash in ways that expose the sport's enforcement inconsistencies and rule ambiguities. Portia Archer's commentary credentials include a deep understanding of this business reality. She serves on the board of a sports marketing firm that represents 12 WTA players and has been vocal in player council meetings about the need for clearer conduct standards precisely because ambiguity creates sponsorship risk. A brand partnering with a player needs to know that player won't become embroiled in a conduct controversy that forces the brand to either defend behavior they find questionable or distance themselves from an athlete they've invested in promoting. When Kyrstia's tactics became a multi-day news cycle, amplified by one of the sport's respected voices, her modest sponsor portfolio became even harder to expand. Brands looking to enter tennis sponsorship have dozens of options. Why choose a player whose name now auto-completes with dirty tactics in search engines? The global broadcasting landscape adds another layer of complexity. In Western European markets, where tennis receives extensive coverage on Eurosport and national networks, the Ostapenko-Chyrstia controversy was framed largely as a debate about sportsmanship and rule interpretation, with panel discussions and player interviews exploring both perspectives. In Eastern European markets, particularly in Romania and Latvia, the coverage was more tribal. Romanian media defended Kyrstia as the victim of unfair accusations from a volatile opponent, while Latvian outlets celebrated Ostapenko for speaking truth that other players were too politically cautious to voice. These divergent narratives create challenges for the WTA's marketing department, which prefers storylines that unite audiences rather than divide them along national lines. Social media economics have fundamentally altered how these controversies play out and who benefits from them. In the pre-Instagram era, a player accused of questionable tactics faced primarily negative consequences: critical press coverage, damaged reputation, potential sponsor discomfort. Now, the calculus is different. Both Ostapenko and Kyrstia saw significant spikes in social media engagement following the incident, with Ostapenko's follower growth already mentioned and Kyrstia gaining 26,000 Instagram followers in the same week, many of them Romanian fans rallying to support her, but also casual tennis fans who simply wanted to follow the storyline. Engagement rate matters more than raw follower count for monetization purposes, and both players saw their engagement metrics rise, meaning their posts were reaching more people and generating more interactions. In the attention economy, being part of a compelling controversy can be more valuable than being uncontroversial and ignored. Tournament attendance data provides mixed signals on whether villain players actually drive ticket sales. The WTA doesn't release player-specific attendance impact studies, but anecdotal evidence from tournament directors suggests that controversial personalities sell tickets in the early rounds when fans are buying sessions rather than individual matches, but might suppress attendance in finals if casual fans prefer to see a more universally beloved champion. Ostapenko's semifinal match in Miami drew a crowd estimated at 86% capacity, strong for a non-final, but not exceptional. Had Kyrstia advanced further, it would have been interesting to see whether the controversy drove additional interest or whether fans stayed away preferring not to reward behavior they found distasteful. The coaching perspective on these tactics reveals a professional consensus that's more accepting than the public fan reaction. Multiple coaches, speaking on Background to Tennis journalists in the week following the controversy, acknowledged that they've instructed players to use medical timeouts strategically when legal and necessary to stop opponent momentum. The consensus view among coaching professionals seems to be that if the rules allow something, and the stakes are high enough, then using every available tool is part of elite competition rather than cheating. This perspective explains why players like Kvitova and Halep offered public support to Kyrstia. They understand the pressure of competing at the highest level and the reality that psychological gamesmanship is woven into tennis at every level, from juniors taking bathroom breaks before serving for a match to professionals getting lengthy injury treatments between sets. What makes Portia Archer's position particularly interesting is that she straddles these worlds. Former player who understands the competitive pressure to use every edge, but also media professional who recognizes that public perception and sport growth require standards that go beyond technically legal. Her on-air comment that Ostapenko's accusations were uncomfortable but necessary captured this tension perfectly. The discomfort comes from players breaking the unwritten code against publicly accusing peers of rule exploitation. The necessity comes from the reality that without public pressure, neither the WTA nor individual umpires have sufficient incentive to crack down on behavior that, while technically within the rules, undermines the spirit of fair competition. For Jelena Ostapenko, the immediate future involves capitalizing on her return to form while managing the reputation she's building as tennis's most vocal truth-teller. Her current ranking of 17th projects to hold through the clay court season if she can match her previous year's results on the surface where she's historically most dangerous. Being seated at Roland Garros would give her a favorable draw path through the first few rounds and position her as a legitimate dark horse contender, the kind of narrative that broadcast partners love and that creates the commercial opportunities she'll need if she wants to extend her career beyond the grind of week-to-week tour stops. Her ELO rating, which adjusts for opponent strength and surface, currently sits at 1847, placing her 12th on tour and suggesting her ranking will likely continue climbing even if her results are merely solid rather than spectacular. The controversy surrounding her willingness to call out Cirstea could work in her favor if she frames it consistently as advocacy for fair play rather than personal grievance. Several sports marketing executives interviewed by tennis publications in the aftermath suggested that brands increasingly value athletes who demonstrate strong personal convictions and aren't afraid of controversy, particularly if they can articulate their position coherently rather than simply appearing volatile. Ostapenko's post-match comments and subsequent interviews showed a player who's thought carefully about the issue and can distinguish between legitimate gamesmanship and behavior she views as damaging to the sport. If she continues this approach, speaking out on issues but doing so with substance rather than just emotion, she could build a post-playing career as an analyst or commentator, following the path that Portia Archer has successfully navigated. For Sorana Cirstea, the path forward is considerably more treacherous. At 34, she's reached the age where most players without Grand Slam success have transitioned into retirement or drastically reduced schedules. Her ranking of 68th puts her in the frustrating zone where she's too low to get direct entry into the main draw of smaller tournaments that conflict with bigger events, but not quite low enough to easily dominate the lower-tier ITF circuit. The mathematics of ranking defense become brutal in this situation. Every point she earned in previous years must be replaced by matching or exceeding that result, and her body's ability to compete at full capacity week after week naturally diminishes with age. The reputational damage from being labeled as someone who employs dirty tactics, even if she's never formally penalized, creates additional burden. Umpires are human and influenced by narratives even when they try not to be. If Cirstea takes a medical timeout in a future match at a similar juncture, the umpire will be aware of the controversy, aware that the decision will be scrutinized, and potentially less inclined to grant benefit of doubt on close calls. Opponents will also feel emboldened to question timeouts or voice complaints to the chair, knowing they have precedent and public opinion potentially on their side. This doesn't mean Cirstea will be unable to take legitimate medical timeouts when needed, but it does mean each one carries higher scrutiny and reputational cost than it did before Ostapenko spoke out, and Archer amplified the concerns. For the WTA Tour, the future implications center on whether they use this controversy as an opportunity to clarify and strengthen enforcement around medical timeouts and time violations, or whether they continue with the current system that prioritizes player autonomy and medical privacy over addressing perception problems. The organization has a player council that includes active tour veterans, and reports from sources close to the council suggest that medical timeout abuse was discussed in their most recent quarterly meeting, with several players expressing frustration at inconsistent enforcement, but no consensus on how to fix it without creating new problems. The challenge is that any rule change that limits medical timeout discretion risks causing harm to players with legitimate medical needs. Imagine a player with a genuine injury crisis being denied treatment because new rules impose stricter timing restrictions or require more invasive medical documentation. One potential solution floated by Rules Committee members is implementing a challenge system similar to video review in line calls, where opponents could formally challenge the timing or legitimacy of a medical timeout, triggering a more thorough review by tournament medical staff and potentially a penalty if the timeout is deemed to have been taken in bad faith. This approach would shift the burden from umpires making real-time judgments to a more deliberative process with multiple experts weighing in. The downside is obvious. It would slow matches even further, create additional confrontational moments, and still ultimately rely on subjective judgments about a player's internal experience of pain or discomfort. Few sports have successfully implemented systems that police whether an injury is real enough to justify treatment without creating new controversies. The more likely outcome is incremental adjustment rather than systematic overhaul. Umpire training will likely emphasize stricter enforcement of time violations, with supervisors reviewing match data to ensure umpires are consistently calling violations rather than issuing endless warnings. Medical timeout procedures might be tightened to require clearer documentation and potentially limit the length of timeouts unless specific interventions like taping or ice application are performed. These changes would happen quietly, without formal rule amendments or press releases, because the WTA prefers evolution over revolution when it comes to controversial rule areas. But the Ostapenko-Krstia incident, amplified by Portia Archer's analysis, created enough public awareness that both players and umpires will feel pressure to adjust behavior even without explicit rule changes. Sponsorship considerations for both players will unfold over the next 6 to 12 months as existing contracts come up for renewal and new opportunities arise or don't. Ostapenko's Nike deal runs through 2025, with performance bonuses and extension options likely to be exercised given her improved results. Her willingness to create controversy might actually help her land partnerships with brands that value authenticity and edge over conventional polish. Think sports betting companies, energy drinks, or tech brands looking to align with disruptive personalities rather than safe choices. Krsstia's sponsorship situation is more precarious. Her Adidas apparel arrangement is up for renewal in early 2025, and while the brand has shown loyalty to veteran players, they also have limited budget for tour players outside the top 50 and numerous younger players seeking partnerships. If her ranking continues sliding and the tactical reputation persists, renewal becomes less likely. The legacy implications for both players will ultimately be determined by what happens on court in the next few years, rather than by this single controversy. If Ostapenko parlays her current form into another deep Grand Slam run, or even a second title, she'll be remembered as a twice champion with a fiery personality who wasn't afraid to challenge the game's unwritten rules. The Krstia incident will be a footnote in that narrative. If her ranking stagnates and she fades back into the journeywoman pack, she'll be remembered as a talented but maddeningly inconsistent player whose outspokenness created drama that her results didn't quite justify. For Krstia, a strong finish to 2024 and one final career resurgence would allow her to retire with dignity and redirect attention back to her longevity and professionalism. Without that, she risks being remembered more for how she competed than for what she accomplished, a fate no athlete wants but many face when career twilight coincides with reputation controversy. The Ostapenko-Krstia incident, and Portia Archer's unflinching analysis of it, exposes the central tension in professional tennis between the sport's aristocratic origins that value genteel conduct and unspoken codes, and the modern reality of tennis as high-stakes entertainment, where millions of dollars and global rankings hinge on every point. When the rules create gray areas large enough for tactical exploitation, and when enforcement is inconsistent enough that players can operate at the edge without consequence, accusations of dirty tactics become inevitable. What made this controversy resonate beyond the insular tennis community was the pattern recognition. The data showing that Krsstia's behavior wasn't just an isolated judgment call in one match, but a career-long approach to managing momentum and controlling pace through methods that are technically legal, but ethically ambiguous. Portia Archer's willingness to call this out, backed by statistical analysis rather than just opinion, represents a shift in how tennis controversies are discussed. She didn't traffic in personal attacks or question Krsstia's character. She presented data about timing patterns and asked the uncomfortable question of whether behaviors that consistently correlate with competitive advantage should be considered legitimate tactics or rule exploitation. That framing makes the debate productive rather than just tribal, focusing attention on the system that allows these gray areas, rather than simply vilifying individual players who operate within them. It also positions Archer as the kind of analyst the sport needs more of, someone with playing credibility who can translate insider knowledge into accessible critique without losing nuance or fairness. The WTA's challenge moving forward is figuring out how to maintain the competitive integrity that makes tennis compelling while accommodating the physical demands that require medical treatment and the human psychology that makes momentum management part of elite competition. There's no perfect solution because the core problem is unfixable. You can't create rules that prevent all tactical exploitation without either becoming absurdly restrictive or granting officials godlike authority to judge intent. What you can do is acknowledge that patterns matter, that timing matters, and that enforcement must be consistent enough to discourage behavior that may be legal but damages the sport's credibility and fan trust. Whether the WTA has the institutional will to address this head-on, or whether they'll continue with the current system of case-by-case judgments and reactive controversy management, will reveal a lot about their priorities. Does long-term sport integrity matter more than short-term conflict avoidance? The debate questions for the audience are these. First, should the WTA implement stricter penalties for time violations and medical timeout timing, even if it risks penalizing players with legitimate needs and slowing the pace of play through additional reviews and challenges? Is the cost of over-enforcement worth paying to eliminate the perception that players can game the system? And second, does Jelena Ostapenko's willingness to publicly call out what she sees as dirty tactics make her a hero for fair play who's saying what other players won't, or does it make her just another complainer who's using controversy to deflect from her own inconsistency and code violation history? The answer probably depends on whether you value the unwritten code that players don't publicly criticize peers, or whether you believe that code protects bad behavior and should be broken when patterns become undeniable.